My people, we're ready to mount up like an eagle. Stand and fight against evil. A system rigged and deceitful. King, you can hear it when I rhyme. I'm a king, renewed in my mind. I'm a king, I got a different bloodline. I'm a king, jump, I am a king. Yeah.
What's good, family? Welcome to the King Talks podcast, where we're all about the truth, community, and discussing the things you care about. I'm your host, Sean Slaughter. And on today's show, we interview Jemar Tisby. Jemar serves as the president of The Witness, a Black Christian collective. He's also the co-host of the Pass the Mic podcast. His book, The Color of Compromise, was published in January 2019, and it's a historical survey of the American church's complicity with racism, with practical suggestions for moving forward. Y'all ready for this? Let's get into it.
My people, we're ready to mount up like an eagle. Stand and fight against evil. A system rigged and deceitful. King, you can hear it when I rhyme. I'm a king, renewed in my mind. I'm a king, I got a different bloodline. I'm a king, jump, I am a king. I'm a king.
Jemar, what's up, man? Are you there?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. It's a pleasure to be on the show. Such an esteemed host and intelligent listeners. I appreciate that.
That's what's up, man. That's what's up. Thank you so much. I gotta, before we get into this, I got a couple of things I need to address with you. First of all, what is a KoolAid pickle?
A KoolAid pickle. My goodness.
Can you please break that down?
It's a pickle. It's a pickle, but instead of being steeped in the regular pickle juice, it's got KoolAid mixed in it. Usually it's red. Red is a flavor, obviously. And so you can find KoolAid pickles all over the Deep South, mainly in gas stations in predominantly Black communities. So that was one of the things that I had to learn about, one of the culinary delicacies moving from the Midwest down to the Deep South.
I've honestly never heard of a KoolAid pickle. Does it have? What's the flavor like? I can't really. Is it only red? The red flavor, and what is it? What does it taste like? Is it sour? I don't know. What does it taste like? Break it down for us.
So I'm not a big pickle fan. I've tried it like once, and it's a combination of sweet and sour. You can taste the sweet from the KoolAid,
okay,
but also kind of the bite of a regular pickle. I used to be a teacher a middle school teacher, and the kids just loved it for some reason. And they come in, and their hands were all red, stained from eating the pickle, and I'm just like, what is this? So that was one of the many new things that I tried down here. But yeah.
Very interesting. Okay, cool. Also, your book is forwarded by Lecrae, of course, enormous Christian rap artist. How'd you make that happen?
It's an answer to prayer. I put it out there and really didn't necessarily expect him to respond, not because he wasn't interested, but he's a busy man, Grammy Award winning hip hop artist and taking pictures with Steph Curry and all these stars. We just made the pitch to him and said, hey man, we really think your story, I personally resonate a lot with his story. Having gained a lot of fame and success initially with white evangelicals as his supporters, but then being more vocal about issues of injustice, especially systemic and institutional injustice, and then getting all of that pushback, as well as his desire to constantly speak to people who he was familiar with, the kind of folks he grew up with. And that's been a very similar journey to my own. And so I just thought his voice would be ideal for this. And he was gracious enough to read an early draft of the book and then speak very authentically out of his experiences. And that's one of the parts of the book that I am most proud of is Lecrae's foreword.
Okay. Let's talk about that real quick. So you are a graduate of Notre Dame. Am I saying it right? Notre Dame.
I heard one of the administrators say once it retains the French pronunciation of the first word and the Americanized pronunciation of the second word, so it would be Notre Dame.
Notre Dame. Okay. So when you talk about gaining this, I guess the white evangelical, I guess the thumbs up, and then expressing, the issues and concerns of your own community and getting that pushback, where did you find that at? When did that happen?
So the issues of race and religion have always been prominent in my mind. I became a Christian in high school, and it was through a youth group that was connected to a white evangelical church. Thankfully, I got the Bible, I got Jesus, but it was in a context where I was one of the only people of color in the congregation. And so, that was just the thing at that stage in my life. It was, I was aware of it, didn't really know what to do with it or how to process it. Fast forward into adulthood, this issue of race and particularly evangelicalism really takes on potency in 2011 when I helped to start two organizations. One was called the African American Leadership Initiative, which was a program through the seminary I was attending, and it was designed to recruit more Black people to the seminary and also equip people of any race or ethnicity for cross-cultural ministry. And the second organization I helped to start was the Reformed African American Network, which was really designed to be a virtual community of theologically like-minded Black Christians. And when we started those two things, we got a lot of support and a lot of engagement, but we also got a lot of pushback from Christians who essentially said, well, if you even talk about race, you're being racist.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
And also, sort of a similar argument was that any talk about systems of oppression or power dynamics that would essentially name whiteness as a social construct as the problem, people perceive that as being personally hateful toward white people as individuals. So they weren't able to separate those concepts of whiteness as a construct and people who have been racially coded as white and their individual actions.
Why is it so hard for white people and white Christians in general? Because this is really what your book talks about. And we're gonna dive into it. But you've kind of taken us down this little rabbit hole, so we're gonna follow it. Why is it so hard for white Christians to accept history? Because really, I'm reading your book, The Color Compromise. It's a historical survey, which is interesting. We'll talk about that a little bit. Why you wrote it as a historical survey, but as I'm reading the book, I'm reading history, and so it's funny. I'm a middle school teacher at an alternative school.
Hey. Awesome.
And I teach technology. All my listeners are probably tired of hearing me say this to every guest, but anyway. And I love teaching at the alternative school. And it's funny, some of the sitting at lunch today, some of the things that you wrote in your book, I start talking to the history teacher about. I start talking about Jonathan Edwards. I start talking about George Whitby. I start just breaking down some of these things, the Great Awakening, and this teacher's a Christian as well. And it's interesting, that collision of Christianity and history that you bring to the book. But it's history. This is not something that did not happen. It's not something that we're making up. At the end of the day, it's really kind of something that we're reporting. And we're reporting it because probably, up until this point, or the last decade or two, it's always been taboo, to even talk about it. We've just had to kind of assimilate to what we've been given and never be able to talk about social justice and certain things like that. Why is that such a difficult thing?
Oh, there's so many layers to this. First of all, the history has been available, but it has not been accessed by Christians. In the 50s and 60s, historians underwent a big shift in the academy to doing less of what they call top-down history, talking about the great men, and they were usually men that people focused on, or the great institutions, like the founding fathers or the federal government. They shifted from doing those kinds of histories because it left out so many people and so many stories, and they really began focusing on race, gender, and class. Those three sort of threads throughout history. And when you do that, you bring in the voices of the marginalized and the experiences of the oppressed. And so historians for decades have been doing this in every field of history, from civil rights to colonial era to Atlantic history, you name it. But Christians, white evangelical Christians in particular, haven't really accessed this because those scholarly works have been coded as secular liberal and therefore not trustworthy.
Oh, interesting.
So the people who know this stuff the best, who literally dedicate their careers to unearthing this history and to analyzing it, that conversation has almost been completely avoided among institutional Christianity in certain circles. And so there wasn't this background. That's one reason. Another reason is the way evangelicals think of the faith, which is a very individualistic kind of faith. It's all about personal conversion, a personal relationship with Jesus Christ, personal sin, personal salvation, and there's a lot to that is right and commendable. But the flip side of it is folks don't tend to think in communal or collective terms. And so it's really one of the distinctives of North American evangelicalism is its individuality. It's a hyper individuality, and I would recommend the book Divided by Faith by Michael Emerson and Christian Smith that break this down from a sociological standpoint, and I talk a little bit about it in the book. But the theological and cultural toolkit that white evangelicals have actually makes it really difficult for them to conceptualize a systemic and institutional sin, in this case racism. And I think that's the fundamental divide. Is you'll look at an incident like Mike Brown's killing in Ferguson. So a lot of white evangelicals looked at that isolated incident and they were like, well, what did he do? What did the officer do? Did he deserve it? Yeah, he probably did, was what a lot of people say. And then black people are looking at, here we go again. And it's the idea that this is part of a pattern. This isn't the first time that it's happened. In fact, the Watts uprising in the mid-1960s was about a police-related encounter with black people in this predominantly black community. The Black Panthers, where the full title is the Black Panther Party for Self-Defense. Self-defense
right.
Against whom? Against law enforcement in their communities. And so black people are seeing this sort of communal, collective, systemic issue, and many white people who are so used to thinking individualistically are seeing isolated incidents, and that's where we have to bridge the divide.
And I think that's so interesting because that individualistic thinking is really more of an American ideal than a biblical principle. If you really look at the Bible and you look at Acts and you look at what happened after these conversions, especially of different cultures, after it happened, really, it was really more of community and serving one another and sharing with one another, more than the kind of, pull yourself by your bootstrap religion. You know what I'm saying? Which more is more of like a John Wayne, a John Wayne Christianity. I can do it by myself. I can beat the, I can ride into town on the horse and beat the 50 bad guys. That's really more of an American ideal.
What Emerson and Smith show, they show that even among Western civilization, if you will, that's a loaded term, but Western society is individualistic in general. But among white evangelicals, they're showing that it's even more individualistic. But here's a 301, 401 level kind of interpretation, because I know your listeners are so smart. It's selective. It's selective. So white people in general and white evangelicals specifically know how to think and act collectively and communally. It just depends on the issue. And so when it comes to if it comes to the issue of abortion or prayer in schools or the Bible in schools, or you go back further, prohibition, or even during the Civil War, if you were a Southern Christian and you wanted to take a stand on the issue of slavery and its expansion or preservation, white folks can come together for a cause, and they can come together for a public cause that they think is a justice-related issue. It's really interesting when and where they draw the line, and throughout history that has typically been on issues of slavery, segregation, and institutional racism. That's where they say, oh, no, it's all individual. There's no systemic issue. We don't need to work through laws or policies. So it's selective, and folks know how to come together and think collectively and communally when it's a cause they want to promote.
Yeah, and I think that selectiveness, we can find that in history. I think that's something that runs throughout the kind of the theme of your book. And if you read through the whole book, you end up to today, and you can see the thread that's kind of weaved through the whole thing. Let's kind of jump into your book. So I got like a million questions. I'm gonna try to keep the interview to an hour because in today's age, many people don't want to hear a 2-hour interview. But I got a million questions, man.
No, I got you.
Right off, well, I'm not going to start with that one. Europeans began coming into contact with North America, and you state that racism as a caste system was not formed yet. What was race relations like at this time? Well, what was kind of the racial construct at this time? What did Colonial, the colonists think about race?
Good. Well, let me just set the stage by highlighting two themes that'll help people make sense of everything else I'm going to talk about. One theme is that it didn't have to be this way. And the other theme is that racism never goes away. It just adapts. So on the first theme, it gets to your question of, in the colonial era, this idea of a racial hierarchy as we now know it wasn't pre-established, wasn't inevitable. It had to be formed. It had to be decided by individuals and institutions making specific choices. And that is true in every era of U.S. history. Now, as you go on down the line and get to more recent times, that structure is more rigid and more established, so it gets harder to change. But there's always been opportunities to go a different way. So it's important for us to keep in mind in the 21st century, as we look back on U.S. history and see racism throughout, we think it's inevitable, it was just baked in, but actually it was deliberate choices, which also should give us hope that if it was deliberate choices that led us down this road, it's going to be deliberate choices that can lead us down a new, better, more racially equitable path too. The second theme is that racism never goes away, it adapts. And so I think there are three big movements of racism. One is race-based chattel slavery from, about the mid-17th century to the Civil War. The next phase was segregation, and that's the Jim Crow era from about the end of the Civil War to essentially Brown v. Board. And then the latest iteration is institutionalized or a racialized society, which works itself out in more subtle ways. So if you only think of racism as this thing where I'm calling somebody the N-word or I'm putting a sign over a drinking fountain, then you're going to think racism is pretty much over. And that's a problem. You got to know racism adapts. It looks different in different eras. So in the colonial era, look, don't get me wrong, people have twisted hearts, and they're going to come up with ways to, we're always going to come up with ways to put ourselves above other people. And we have journal entries from Christopher Columbus in the 1490s saying that, he's basically evaluating Native Americans based on their lightness of skin and their similarity to Europeans. And then he's going further to say that, these people will be good servants, but without ever considering they might be our equals. We might need to deal with them as regular human beings and not as these sort of savages as they characterized them. So that was always there, but it wasn't inscribed in society the way it became became throughout the passing decades. And so there could have been people who stood up and said, no, their nationality, their race, their tribe, their ethnicity, it doesn't matter. If we're going to form a democracy, then all people need to be included. But obviously, things didn't turn out that way.
Yeah. You said something, you said a mouthful, but you said one thing that really stood out to me. And you talked about, and that's another thing that I got from your book, how we're in chattel slavery and we're dealing with that concept. Civil War happens, Reconstruction. There's a period where blacks are like, finally, we can get the freedom, that we've always wanted. And then racism reinvents itself with Jim Crow.
Right.
And it continues to reinvent themselves. And you say this is what maybe kind of stick out in your book, just kind of the very beginning. The people who will reject this book will level several common objections. And I want to skip down to the objection that I think is kind of prevalent today. They will contend that such an extended discussion of racism reduces black people to a state of helplessness and a victim mentality. And as I read that, there's another word, the inferiority complex, where we keep talking about racism and we're free. You know what I'm saying? We're not in chains. We don't drink out of separate water fountains. The things that Martin Luther King fought for, we're seeing today, and so on and so forth. And so you have those that will say, why are we still having this conversation? Why are we still talking about this? You're victimizing yourselves. You know what I'm saying? You have some kind of inferiority complex. And what I'm hearing from you, what you're saying is that this idea of racism has just morphed. And it's going to look different than it did. Now, that doesn't mean that racism has not been reduced. But when it comes to systematic racism, it's just changed. How would you address somebody that says that to you? Come on, man, you got a victim mentality, man.
Right.
Come on.
So when the oppressed talk about their oppression, that doesn't disempower them, that empowers them. What it does, it gives voice to that which has been hidden, denied, or even outright condoned.
But let me cut you off, Jemar. Let me cut you off.
Yeah.
Because you said when the oppressed, I'm going to play devil's advocate. You said when the oppressed talk about their oppression, it frees them up in the same way that I like using this idea of a child being abused and never saying anything. And then they get to the point where they begin to talk about that abuse and they actually begin to experience, freedom. Some of those chains and weights and anxieties and traumas, they actually begin to, free up some of that. But some people will say, Jemar, we're not oppressed. So what are you talking about? When the oppressed talks about the oppression, we're not oppressed. I can get any job that I want to get. I can so on and so forth. What is your rebut to that?
This stuff, I'm sure a lot of people have heard that. Well, there's two factors. There's the past in the historical record, and there's the present issues that we're dealing with. So in the historical record, if you can't see that black people have been egregiously oppressed in many, many different ways, I don't know what to tell you because it's all there. The facts are written down, from race-based chattel slavery, where we were literally commodified and classified basically on the same level as horses or farm implements, to Jim Crow segregation, where they could never even get an anti-lynching law passed. It took until the 21st century when the three black U.S. senators, and there's only three, all came together to propose yet another bill, an anti-lynching bill, in 2019, that it actually passed through the Senate. And those are just, some of the most obvious forms of oppression. And you could name many, 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 which I try to do in my book. The other aspect is the present reality. So you have to look at some of the ways that we live in a racialized society, which means that according to quality of life factors, it still breaks down along racial lines. I'll just tell a personal example. I live in the Mississippi Delta on the Arkansas side. I was just looking at the stats, and I Googled poorest counties in the United States. I live in the fourth poorest county in the entire United States. That is directly connected to the history of sharecropping and race-based chattel slavery. So the Delta is this really fertile land along both sides of the Mississippi River. It was great cotton growing country. In many of these communities, black people outnumbered white people because you needed more slaves to work the plantation than slave owners. And so that what happened was after emancipation, that population, if they didn't have the resources to move to an urban area in the north or somewhere else, they stayed. And most of the time, the land went right back to their former plantation owners, and the plantation owners still needed cheap labor, and black people still needed work, so they went back to picking cotton. Well, that became sharecropping, which was an exploitative labor system, but even sharecropping dies out as farming becomes mechanized, and you need fewer and fewer physical laborers there. And then people still don't have the means to get up and out. Education is underfunded. All of these things that would move you up the socioeconomic ladder are not available. And so now you have generation after generation of people in poverty. And now they're coming into my sixth grade classroom, students who are functionally homeless, staying in 3 or 4 different homes a week, can't afford clothes for dress-up day, parents deciding between paying an electric bill or buying food. And are you going to blame that or to just say black people are lazy? Like, to me, that's incredibly insulting. And it also is absolutely devoid of context. And that can be found not just in the rural South, but in urban areas too, with the history of the GI Bill and redlining and segregation and all these benefits being funneled mainly to white male breadwinners. And they had provisions during the New Deal. FDR couldn't get legislation passed unless Southern Dixiecrats, they insisted on home rule and states' rights, meaning they'll say, okay, you can pass these laws, but when it comes to distributing the financial benefits and the jobs, we get to, in Mississippi, in Arkansas, in Georgia, in Alabama, we get to decide who that goes to. And you know the 2 groups they excluded? Domestic workers and agricultural workers. Who were they? They were the help, which were black women in white people's homes being maids, and they were sharecroppers, and so who were black. And so these are how resources get deliberately directed through laws, policy systems, and they have reverberations today. I was just reading, I'll give one more fact. I was just reading about student loan debt. You know, Robert F. Smith gives this $40 million gift to the 2019 graduating class at Morehouse College for student debt relief. He's paying off all their student debt. Well, on average, black students take out 85% more in loans than white students.
You say 85%?
And when you peel back the layers, 85% more, and then have a harder time paying it back because they tend to make less money over the course of their careers.
Wow.
So when you peel back the layers and ask why, you're left with one of 2 options. You can either say it's because of these people or it's because of their culture, and typically this is black and brown people, or you can say there's something wrong with the system. And that's what I'm arguing in the book.
And I think what's interesting about that is you would find a lot of people saying it's these people and their culture. And
unapologetically.
Unapologetically and literally painting this, painting our culture as, and we see it, people who are lazy, people who want, to get over quick, people who so on and so forth, and literally just ignore the hundreds of years of history that's produced this. It's funny, the conversation that I'll have with people is I'll say, call it post-traumatic slave disorder, right? And I'll say, imagine, again, taking that idea of a child abused, a child that's been raped at a younger age or in the teens, and how throughout their life they experience this trauma throughout their life, and they may get therapy and they may get so on and so forth, and they may get healed and all that type of stuff, but there's going to be some scars there. There's going to be some brokenness there. And I say, now you take that to generations of people over hundreds of years, and you think, because as a historian, 60, 70, 80 years is a snap of a finger when it comes to history. Mm-hmm. And so you think 70, my father, who is in his mid-60s, remembers, he's from New York, and he remembers driving down to Virginia, and he remembers that, you know, he would have to go to the bathroom, but they would have to pass so many restaurants and rest stops because they were whites-only restaurants and rest stops.
Right.
That's my dad, not my granddad, my great-great-granddad, or my great-great-great-great-great-granddad. That's my father. You know what I'm saying? And so you're talking about these, and just kind of to your point, really, these hundreds and hundreds of years of slavery and the decimation it's done to our culture, and to think that 60 or 70 years of freedom, you know, when we're not drinking out of different water fountains and so on and so forth, is going to propel us to the next level. And if we haven't gotten to that next level, then it's because of us. I think that's asinine. So I would totally agree with you, man.
And I'll say this to your point about the victim mentality. I'll say, if you look at the history of African Americans in this nation, we are far from people who have passively accepted injustice. We are fighters and survivors. The fact that we are, you know, the question is not, well, why can't African Americans do better, or why are they doing so bad? The real question is, how are we doing so well, considering what we've been through?
Absolutely.
I mean, you know, it's not that long ago that you could be arrested just for trying to vote and you were the wrong skin color. And we're still fighting that battle today, honestly.
Yep.
And so in the midst of that, it is incredible that we've been able to laugh, to love, to build families, businesses, communities, education, all of that in the midst of a society that has been constructed to disadvantage people of a certain background so mightily. And yet, we've struggled, we've persevered, we've survived, we've even thrived in certain instances. You know, you talked about Reconstruction, the period from about 1865 to 1877.
Something weird happened.
Yeah, the devil's always busy on these conversations.
You know it. So let's pick it back up. We were talking about black people striving in face of you know, the different things they faced, and you were just starting to talk about the Reconstruction period and those short couple of years where, you know, they had their freedom.
Yeah, I'll just give one brief example of black people striving. Was from the period from about 1865 to 1877 is what historians call Reconstruction. And for the longest time, pro-slavery agitators, people who wanted to preserve slavery and expand it, said black people needed to be enslaved because they weren't ready for citizenship. They wouldn't know what to do with it. They wouldn't handle the responsibility well. Well, Reconstruction completely proved them wrong, because as soon as black people got free, they did a couple of things. Number one, they searched for family members who had been sold away and separated, spouses, children, aunts, uncles, parents. They put ads in newspapers. They made announcements at churches. They looked for loved ones. So they tried to build their families. And so there's this myth of, you know, black people not caring about families or not caring about kids. That's a myth. Number two, they sought their education. And because most white people, particularly in the South, but really around the country, weren't too interested in educating black people, many times they started their own schools. Now, these people are already broke because they're recently freed enslaved people.
Sure.
So it's not like they had a 401k or a savings account, right? But they scrimped and they saved and they built their own schools, educated their own teachers, so built colleges so that teachers could get trained and go back and teach younger people. And they also built businesses, banks, and you know, places to sell different goods. And they also ran for office. And you have folks like Robert Smalls and PBS Pinchback and many, many others who are in state and even U.S. legislatures. And so they're tackling this freedom. They're embracing it vigorously until that becomes until that starts to get taken away in a period that I think is ominously but tellingly named redemption. And that's the period right after Reconstruction where white people, particularly in the South, begin to change the laws, literally rewrite their state constitution to disenfranchise black people. One of the first things they did was take away the vote, but also began this period of violent terrorism with lynchings and rapes designed to, quote unquote, keep black people in their place and reinvent racism in a different form.
Yeah. Why did you think African slaves were so attracted to the Christian message and became converted? Because this was and we know the history as far as Africa and really early Christianity in Africa, but just concerning America, why would they take on the religion of their oppressors?
Yeah, that's a good point. I'm glad you mentioned Africa, because Christianity was in the Middle East and Africa long before it was in Europe. I think people have this erroneous historical idea that Europeans introduced Christianity to Africans, and that's simply not the case. But as you go further down in the generations and you have enslaved people being born in what is now the United States, it is an interesting question. Why would someone take on the religion of their oppressors? As a person of faith, I think it's a spiritual thing as well, that there was something deep within the soul of enslaved black people that heard in the God of Christianity a message of liberation, a message of dignity and freedom and self-worth. And they were able to hear that message through the white noise, if you will, of racism and their oppressors. And if you look at the second book of the Bible, the book of the Exodus, that speaks directly to the black experience in the United States. It's a message about slaves being liberated from slavery. And so when black people heard those stories, they said, hey, that's us, in a very existential way, not just a kind of spiritual, symbolic way, but a literal, physical, material way. And they saw, like, this, there's something here. I think there was also a desire and even a need to find meaning in their suffering, which is what Christianity does.
Yes,
yes. You take the central event of the Christian faith, which is the crucifixion of Jesus and his resurrection 3 days later. You have here the most egregious act of injustice in human history, where this truly innocent, the only truly innocent person who ever walked the earth, being crucified like a criminal, as a criminal. And that being the point of uplift and redemption for people who believe in Jesus. And so I think what black Christians, especially in the antebellum era, saw, not that God was the author of their suffering, but that God could redeem it, that he could make meaning out of it. Because here's the alternative. There are going to be a lot of people who say, Christianity is all about suffering and glorifies suffering. No, it doesn't. What Christianity does is say that you are here for a reason beyond your suffering.
Yes, yes.
Because what's the alternative? You live and you die in slavery. Not everybody was living in the shadow of the Civil War when it looked like, okay, the nation could split over this and they're going to fight to determine whether slavery exists in this land or not. There were people born in the 1600s and 1700s or brought here at that time who never saw an end to their suffering. What gets them through? How do they survive? And I think they saw in Christianity a message that this life may never be what you want it to be, but there is a home, there is a promised land, there is a chariot coming for to carry me home. I am going to cross the river Jordan into freedom. And that kept them going. And they prayed over generations, and I think those generational prayers are why you and I are sitting where we are today.
Yeah. It's amazing, man. I mean, the power of God is so amazing, how through all the vitriol and the twisting of the scriptures, how God still revealed himself as the one and true God to the slaves, and how they can see through all that. That's just, it just really blows my mind. Can you explain this idea of paternalistic Christianity?
Yeah. Yes. So a lot of this is rooted in the antebellum era and the slave days, where plantation owners saw themselves essentially as the fathers of an extended household. So they would have their natural biological family with their spouse and their children, but then they would view their enslaved people in bondage as their children as well. Not on the same level as their biological children, their white children, but basically they would view it as their job as a plantation owner to essentially be the father to these benighted, uneducated, ignorant black enslaved people. And just like you would train a child and discipline a child, that's what they thought was their job. This was not just a sort of sociological phenomenon about how they ran a plantation. It wasn't just an economic one. It was also a religious one, in the sense that many people who were in the elite white classes didn't think black people could ever learn theology or teach theology. They didn't think they could preach or teach to a racially mixed group because black people wouldn't be advanced enough to do so. They didn't think they could be elders or ordained in some instances, because they viewed them as children who always needed to be under the authority of white Christians, rather than equals who could also preach and teach to anyone and everyone. And this idea of paternalism, I think, has filtered down into the present day, where if you look at the people in certain branches of Christianity who are considered authorities, oftentimes these are white men still. And it may be on a subconscious level, but what the implicit statement there is, the real authorities, the real teachers, the real experts at this all come from a certain background and a certain class and a certain race, and everyone else, it's cool, it's nice that you're doing that, but that's really JV stuff. Here are the varsity theologians and pastors and teachers.
Right. And I'm asking you these questions because I see the connection from hundreds of years ago to today, and the whole idea of paternalistic Christianity, not just affecting black people, but affecting women, affecting white women, and I see those threads today, that when it comes to the real authority, like you said, the varsity, when it comes to those that really are in the know, the major theologians, not only do you not see, not only are blacks not considered, but you can even put women in that category as well.
Absolutely. And the poor.
And the poor. Here's another idea that I think it's stretched itself today. How was the doctrine, and you can explain a little bit, but how was the doctrine of spirituality used to perpetuate slavery?
So there's this idea, again, very selectively applied, that the gospel has only to do with spiritual matters and direct church-related matters. Anything else, such as racism, segregation, anti-lynching laws, mass incarceration, you name it, that's beyond what Christians should be talking about, at least as Christians. And in Southern Presbyterian circles, there was this doctrine called the spirituality of the church. And it was just a real fancy way of saying that the gospel and social justice are two separate things. What they were essentially conveying is that you could convert, you could be a Christian and be black, and God could have your soul, but we've got your body. Anything that has to do with the physical material world, that stuff is separate, and therefore we can still have missionaries who are slave owners. We can still exclude people from congregational worship based on their race. We can still lift up in the present day theologians who were slave owners and not bat an eye and just call that, a blind spot. And black people and other marginalized people groups who were Christians said, no, the gospel has something to say about not just the sweet by and by, but the here and now. Yes. And it's not good news to an oppressed person to speak of a faith that doesn't speak to their oppression. Yes. And so that's what the black church tradition has always done. So this debate among some about the gospel and social justice, the whole framing of that question, that's a very Eurocentric framing. That is not
Yes.
Endemic to the Black church tradition, which always saw, I mean, pastors were oftentimes not just the leader in the congregation, but they were often elected leaders, mayors, city council, representatives, senators. And that was actually seen as a good thing, because you could not be the leader of a Black congregation, especially in decades past, and not attend to very tangible issues such as voting rights, the distribution of economic resources, access to jobs, all of these kinds of things. So, the idea of the spirituality of the church, again, selectively applied because there were certain social justice issues that white Christians took on vigorously. But when it came to issues of race, which would disrupt power dynamics and money, that's when they drew the line and said, no, the church doesn't have anything to do with that.
And again, I asked that question about the doctrine of spirituality. You're familiar with the John MacArthur group and their statement on social justice in the gospel. So I'm reading this in your book, and it's just funny how, again, the thread that runs through history, and this is why history is so important, and it's a shame that the church can call something secular and then basically null and void it. It's almost like, for a long time when you had like secular musicians or even scientists to a certain extent who have made discoveries and have invented things and found things, or found different ways to do music, perform music, different sounds and notes, and you put the secular stamp on it and you can't even touch it because it's not, it's not Christian. And so the doctrine of spirituality and this statement on social justice, me and a friend were talking, and we were like, isn't abortion a social justice issue? How is that not as social justice as a young Black man, being senselessly murdered, by a police officer or whatever? And so, I just find it amazing. I just find that connection between, this principle and what we face today. I find it pretty astounding.
I mean, I think there are two things, at least, that go into that. One is social isolation, and two is a reticence to implicate oneself in systemic injustice. So the social isolation part is many of these folks who think that the gospel and that social justice and the gospel are opposed don't have much significant, meaningful interaction with racial and ethnic minorities or oppressed groups in general, marginalized groups in general. And sometimes these are even Black and Latino folks, because there are some people of color who are on the same page, but they've been so steeped in the dominant culture and have adopted those views that they're actually at odds with the majority of their own racial and ethnic communities. And so it doesn't always just fall neatly along color lines, but you can only tell so much from a person, looking at them online. But if you look at the people they're communicating with, the people they're citing, even the people that they're in pictures with or whatever, it's very homogenous. And it's hard to understand someone else's perspective if you don't have meaningful personal relationships with people who are different. So I think that's one factor. Another factor is a reticence to implicate oneself in institutional injustice, which is a human thing, right? We all want to, on some level, think the best of ourselves or declare ourselves innocent. But when you start talking to white people about systems of power, whether in politics or economics or sociocultural categories, that actually give them advantages because they are coded as white, and give people of color, particularly Black people, disadvantages. Well, guess what? That means if I'm a white person, in some sense, I'm involved, I'm implicated in this system, and I benefit from it. And so does that mean I'm guilty? What does that mean? And I don't want to feel that way about myself. So one reaction, which I think is the wrong reaction, and definitely not a Christian reaction, is to stiff arm all that conversation and say, no, it's not true because I'm not racist. And they're only thinking about racism in one particular way. They're thinking about racism as interpersonal. So I haven't called anybody the N-word. I haven't said you can't come into my church or my house. As a matter of fact, some of my best friends are black. And they use that logic and that reasoning to sort of exonerate themselves, all while ignoring the systemic and institutional and the policies that actually reinforce racial inequality. And then when you talk about that, they say, well, you're calling me a racist, and that's not true. The last word I'll say about that is, a lot of people think that folks like me who talk about racial justice are trying to induce a sense of white guilt. I'm not trying to do that. The Apostle Paul talks in Corinthians about a term called godly grief. And he says he's grateful for godly grief, not because he pained the people he's writing to in Corinth, but because they were grieved into repentance. In other words, they felt the weight of wrongdoing so much that they changed their behavior. And so I'm not interested in white guilt. I am interested in a godly grief that leads to repentance and change.
Yeah. Wow. Man. Well, look, I want to kind of skip forward to the last chapter. And I'm telling you guys, this The Color Compromise, the historical survey, is a fascinating book. It really uncovers history and really just shows the church's complicitness in racism and the establishing of this country and some of its laws that have oppressed, that have created chattel slavery and Jim Crow laws and so on and so forth. And even just to kind of touch on that, I'm going to touch on it and run because I have some other. I want to get to the last chapter, but even the idea of you talk about Ulysses S. Grant and him using what you call overt white sentiment as a political tool. Even that idea, how it still happens today, and again, it's not the overt, blacks over here, whites over here. It's not the overt use of the N-word, but we can obviously see in politics with some of these candidates, particularly the guy that's in office right now, using these same tactics that were used by Ulysses S. Grant. You know what I'm saying? And one man, I can't find the chapter. I don't know if you remember what his slogan was in your book. But his slogan was almost something like, for whites only, or almost like bringing the country back to whiteness or something like that.
Yeah, I think that was maybe a presidential election where they lost. They were running against. Maybe that was the Hayes election.
Yep.
Right at
that's
the end of Reconstruction. Yep. Yeah. So the opposing party, which was at that point the Democrats, they were basically saying, make America white again. I mean, this is a white man's country. And that's literally what they said. This is a white man's country, and they ran on that platform.
That's what it was. Yeah. It's just so interesting, man, how history just repeats itself. Let's get to this this last chapter that you entitled The Fierce Urgency of Now. And I like this because you give solutions. And you talk about the history, you point us to some of the issues, and but you give us some solutions. And I was interesting, and where I stand on this issue, I don't know. I just really don't know. But you talk about reparations. Do you believe in reparations? And what is your view of reparations? Because you also kind of outline, reparations is not just a monetary thing. So what can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, I believe in reparations, and I think given the history, the concept shouldn't even be controversial. So if you think about it, what was race-based chattel slavery? Fundamentally, it was an economically exploitative system. In a capitalist society, your goal is to maximize profit and minimize loss. In any organization, typically your biggest expenditure is on wages and benefits for your employees. So the biggest way to cut costs and maximize your profit, you don't pay your employees. And that's what happened with enslavement. And then after centuries of this, where black people literally built this country, literally built the White House for no compensation, then they fight what is to this day America's bloodiest war to finally end the institution of slavery And what do black people get? Not 40 acres and a mule. They get a big pocket of nothing. And so their physical chains were removed, but in their place came the shackles of poverty. And the reason why people are opposed to it in the 21st century is because in the 19th century, people didn't do the right thing and give black people a portion of what they deserved for their labor. And so people have kicked the can down the road generation after generation after generation to now what the first thing people say when you talk about reparations is they throw their hands up and say, oh, it's too complicated. You can't figure out who gets it, how much they get, you know, what it's worth, all of this stuff. And I'm like, it is a complicated problem because we didn't deal with it 150 years ago when we should have, but that doesn't mean it's not still a problem today. And so some of it's financial, you know, some of it is the fact that white people have between 11 and 13 times more wealth than the median black family. And again, is that just because black people don't know what to do with money? No, there's a history there. The college loans thing that we talked about before and student loan debt, that's affecting everyone, but it acutely affects people who are already poor. So I think it looks like that, but we can get creative with reparations. And so in a Christian frame, what does it look like to help black churches, which are still being burned in racist terrorist attacks? What does it look like to pay off church mortgages so you can actually own your own facility? What does it look like for bivocational pastors who have to work a day job and then give whatever time and energy they have left to ministry? What does it look like to fund their salaries so they can be full-time in ministry? What does it look like to establish a scholarship fund or even start a new historically black Christian college? You know, all kinds of things. I think what we have when it comes to reparations is a failure of will, but also a poverty of imagination. There are a lot of different things that we can do to uplift black people in light of historic and ongoing economic exploitation.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, it's a really good argument, and I think it becomes more difficult, and the idea of reparations becomes more taboo. The more we see in media successful black people, whether they're athletes or so on and so forth. So 150 years ago, it's easier to make reparations happen because it's easy to see who are the haves and the have-nots. But with social media and media today, it looks like everybody's doing fine. And so it's really a good argument and a very good point. Two more things I want to address in your solutions. Why is it important to make Juneteenth a national holiday?
It might be my favorite one. I think it's important for several reasons. One, it's important for past, present, and future. So one, it forces us as a nation annually. So first of all, Juneteenth is the oldest celebration of black emancipation in the country. It commemorates the day when enslaved Africans in Texas found out about their freedom. And for, decades and decades, folks have celebrated this day. And so I think if we made Juneteenth a national holiday, it would force us annually as a nation to take a good long look at the reality that for centuries, the enslavement of black people was the law of the land. And I hope it would cause us some humility and some grief so that we would never move on and say, oh, that's just the past. We would recognize the generational trauma and the ways that racism and enslavement has really shaped the country to this day. So it would give us a moment to pause and look back. But beyond that, not just lamenting, it's actually a moment of celebration so that we can say this deeply embedded system that people were so invested in that they would fight and die for it was abolished. And this is a concrete historical event that signaled racial progress in this nation. And we look back on that event as a sign and source of hope that change is possible. And then it causes us to look to the future as well to say, well, yes, that was progress, but guess what? We're not free until everybody's free. And we still have progress to make. So it would also cause us to evaluate annually where we are now and where we still need to go in terms of racial justice. And so it would constantly push us forward so that our children and generations after us would have more freedom and more liberty than we do now.
Yeah, I love it, man. I live in I live in an area of Virginia called Hampton Roads, and Newport News, Hampton, Williamsburg, this area here. And, it was the Colonial in Williamsburg. It's funny because you talk about it in your book, but Colonial in Williamsburg is right here. But they actually just had to issue a statute saying that the first slaves didn't arrive in Colonial Williamsburg. They actually arrived in Hampton, Virginia, at Fort Monroe. And this was a big deal. It was a big deal that happened, I think, maybe last year, a year ago, because Williamsburg was promoting itself as this is where the first, slaves arrived. But wow. I find it interesting. Yeah, it was kind of crazy. But I also find it interesting because if you walk in downtown Hampton, or if you walk in Newport News, or even outside of Colonial Williamsburg, it's very quiet. I mean, Colonial Williamsburg is really the only area that you can go to that really talks about slavery. But Hampton, Virginia, which has so many you had slaves that went to Fort Monroe. You know what I'm saying? Because it was a place of safety during the war, and very quiet. There's not really, the museum exhibits are very small. It's not something that Hampton is necessarily known for. Hampton University, which was Hampton Institute, which had major historical black figures that went to that school, and it's very, very quiet. And it kind of, when I think about Juneteenth, it kind of reminds me of that similar thing. Like, these are things that we need to highlight and people need to see. Right. And it's funny. I worked at a community center as a director, and my board of directors was a bunch of like politicians, several of them served on, served as politicians, chief of police, city council and all that type of stuff. And, I would talk to them about this, saying, how come we're not talking about this? And the reality is that people just didn't want it in their face. They wanted nothing to do with it. And I'm like, man, it goes back to that same idea of, if we continue to push this thing down, if we continue to just try to bury this thing, I tell you what, whatever you go through, you go ahead and try to bury it and see what happens. All right?
Yeah, buddy. It stinks.
It stinks. Last thing, and this is a pretty bold statement that you make. Start a civil rights movement toward the church. Break that down for me, brother.
Yeah, I think this would maybe be the most controversial idea if people stop to really ponder it. I think for some reason, people kind of skip over it. Maybe it's the end of the book they want to get done. But when we think about the civil rights movement of the 1950s and 60s, it is a protest movement mainly focused in its most public forms around segregation and voting rights. And so it's sort of outward facing in terms of the church. It's from the church, particularly the black church, really. And it is toward public institutions or political bodies. I think Christianity in the United States suffers from a credibility problem. And for so many people who are not Christians or who are ex-Christians or whatever it might be, they're looking at what they see as Christianity, and it's not about justice. It's not about love. It's not about inclusion. And so then when Christians attempt to stand up and speak about injustice, well, they're like, but look at your churches. I mean, y'all have sexual abuse issues that you're not dealing with. You got money issues that pastors are fleecing the flock. And guess what? You have some of the most egregious racism issues in the entire nation. Because you can think of any institution from entertainment to sports to politics, and they have made progress and made explicit statements about racial inclusion. And despite Christian denominations and their statements, it remains extremely not only segregated, but racist. Yeah.
Even Hollywood has made these statements. Hollywood themselves.
That's what I'm saying. Like, how is it that these other institutions and these other sectors of society are leading the way? We are, as Martin Luther King Jr. said, we're being the taillight instead of the headlight on these justice
Come
issues.
on, man. Woof.
And so
Yes.
I think a civil rights movement toward the church, where we hold ourselves accountable for issues of justice, particularly around racial justice, and stand up and say this isn't okay. And what a civil rights movement does towards the church is utilize some of the same tactics of the civil rights movement, from boycotts to sit-ins to marches. What if we did that toward injustice in the church? And what then would be our witness toward a watching world? It would be, okay, these people are serious about justice to the point where they're calling out their own. They're cleaning up their own house. There's something to this. And guess what? They're concerned about other people, too. They're concerned about immigrants. They're concerned about Muslims. They're concerned about women. They're concerned about black and brown people. They're concerned about the poor. And now I believe you because I see you do it in action. So I think, we need to be thinking creatively, because here's the reality. Why are we still dealing with so much racism in the church? We failed to discipline it. We failed to call it out like it needs to be called out. And I don't mean that everybody. People are out here doing it. But we need a mass movement of folks who will rise up and say, no more, not in God's house. This is a house of prayer for all nations.
I heard that, man. And we're going to end it on that note. A powerful, powerful, powerful book, ladies and gentlemen, The Color of Compromise by Jemar Tisby. Jemar, where can they find you? How can they contact you? Maybe give them a website or give them an email, some things to check out. I know you have a wonderful blog, so give them some information that you want to send them to.
I'm going to give y'all a list. Go to our website, thewitnessbcc.com. You can find literally hundreds of blog posts and articles about racial justice from a Christian perspective. Listen to our podcast. It's called Pass the Mic. You can search for it anywhere you download podcasts, and we're on Twitter @_Pass the Mic. I'm on Twitter @Jemar Tisby, JemarTisby, and I also have a website, jemartisby.com.
Gotcha. Sounds dope, man. Sounds dope. What's up?
One more shout out. We are having our first national conference October 4th and 5th in Chicago. The theme is Joy and Justice, continuing the 400-year journey from 1619 to 2019 of Black joy and justice. Visit thewitnessbcc.com or any of our social media channels for details. We hope to see you there.
Dope. So dope. Man, thank you so much. This was excellent. It was enlightening. I'm sure our listeners are going to love this. And Jemar, it was a pleasure to have you on.
Hey, great questions, man. I appreciate the work you're doing, sticking it out in schools. We need you, brother. Those are the front lines. So I have so much respect, and thank you for having me on.
Man, thank you so much. Thanks for listening to the King Talks podcast. You can find out more about King at kingmovement.com. Also, you can subscribe to the podcast on any of your favorite podcast apps or websites. Please be sure to like, share, and subscribe. And finally, my brethren, be strong in the Lord and in the power of his might. Peace. We out.
I brought the Kings with me on this one. It's a movement. Yeah. I had a dream. I saw black slaves in 2018, pulling the big king with a crown in the middle, looking like tug of war. I guess they forgot the inheritance of the Lord, dying over streets when God gave him the earth. It's all in the Bible, just do your research. White man's religion, that's just fake news. The cross hit Africa for Europe even knew. This ain't black versus white, this is dark versus light. But racism might distract you from the Christ on sight. So here's the Visine, me and my team. Dark world, but we flipping on a high beam. King, A's for the knowledge, I is to inspire. N for the nurture, the G is to grow higher. Jesus lit the match, so we all on fire. You see a crown on the attire, know you looking at a fighter. My people, my people.